Welcome, everybody. We'll start in a minute or so. I'm still sending some people the Zoom link. Welcome, welcome. Happy Friday. Okay. We'll give it one more minute while people are still hopping in. And I sent out this last Zoom link. Welcome to our second event of conferences, our short and sweet. Your next conference, we're going to be talking about your presentations and how best to design them today. Let's see. Okay, we can get started. Hopefully you all can see everything okay. I love my scarf too. Okay, let's get started. So I am Jen Merems. I'm the scientific editor with the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research here at UW-Madison within the School of SMPH. And myself and Dr. David Puthoff from Marshfield Clinical Research Institute are going to be talking about how to design your presentations for conferences. This presentation is going to be fun for us. We're probably going to be laughing a bit. As you can see with the meme, don't take everything that you see seriously. We're going to be showing you the do's and don'ts of your presentations. So again, design sort of what's common practice as well as what to do and what not to do. So we're going to show you these things visually. So some things you're going to be like, ew, that's terrible. And that's the point. We want you to feel that way. So I just want to thank our collaborators. There's a bunch of us here from ICTR, like I said, Marshfield Clinic, and then we have the science writer from the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, Rachel. So to begin, I want to talk about a survey that was done in 2019, the Annoying PowerPoint Survey, which is hilariously named. So what they did was they surveyed 236 respondents to try to get an understanding of what annoys you the most when you're doing or when you're viewing a presentation. So over time and since COVID, presentations have gone mostly virtual. Hence, we're doing a virtual presentation right now. And so the amount of people viewing presentations has increased. And as of 2019, 78% of people viewed 2 or more presentations a week. And that's a lot. It went up from 32% seeing at least one presentation daily to now 78% seeing at least 2 or more a week. So they really wanted to understand what makes a bad presentation. And what they found was that when individuals are reading the slides, when there's tiny text, when there's full sentences just pasted on the slide, people get really bored, they check out, and they find it really annoying. They kind of feel that the speaker doesn't have consideration for the audience member, and that what they're doing is they're just making their slide easy for them because they don't have to think, they don't have to practice, they don't have to sort of memorize their presentation. All they have to do is stand there and sort of read the text that's available to them. So this makes it really boring for the audience members, and that's just no fun. We're not posting our manuscripts on the presentation, right? We're here to engage the audience and to explain our research. Oops. So after the pandemic, they wanted to see if these respondents have changed their mind. Has it gotten better or has it gotten worse since presentations went from being mostly in person to now being primarily virtual? And what they found was that things changed slightly. So instead of things being boring because there's lots of text, there's long sentences, the font is tiny on the presentations, what now bothers them is the structure of the slide itself. There's no flow with the information they're sharing. The purpose of what they're trying to tell you is pretty confusing. So they're still pretty annoyed with how presentations were going when they did this survey in 2022. So why should you care about your presentation design? Because we don't want annoying presentations. We want them to be engaging. We want the audience to leave remembering something besides that, yes, it's over and that was boring. I want my hour back. So your role in creating this presentation, as well as presenting the presentation, is to capture your audience's attention and retain it for the entire duration of your presentation. And you do this by designing a thoughtful presentation that amplifies your message and reinforces key points. So your slides are here to be a visual support to help your audience really understand what you're trying to tell them. But is this slide annoying? Look at how many words are present. I basically posted a manuscript on this slide. So are you even listening to what I'm saying, or are you busy reading what's on this slide? Think about that. So what I really just want to say with this slide is that it's here as a visual support. So that's what you need to think about when you're thinking about design, is that what is on the screen is just supporting what you're saying with your voice. Another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about design in general and how you can engage your audience is that humans have a pretty short attention span, and that is decreasing with the advent of short form media, things like TikTok videos, things that are really short. In the early 2000s, our attention span was about 20 seconds. And when this study was done in 2013, that has dropped to 8 seconds. So you can imagine now, what is that a decade later? Is it about the same, or has it gone, reduced down and is now even shorter? And that's shorter than a goldfish potentially, which is kind of sad. So we want to make sure that we hold your engagement for each slide for the entire presentation and to make it worthwhile. So where do we start? And David is going to take it over right now, and we're going to talk about how to make that great presentation.
Thanks, Jen. So really, we want to talk about engagement. I think one of the places we need to start is with preparation. We think about our presentation, and we have to do a thorough presentation. And I think that really means doing what I have not done enough of today, and that's rehearsal. Create your presentation, you read your presentation, you present to an empty room a few times, kind of get the material down. This may vary a little from person to person. You kind of want to develop your own style. You should be comfortable enough with your material that if the technology goes down, for instance, Jen and I were just talking about this, if your text stops, you should be comfortable enough with the material that you can just ad-lib a presentation, right? And not depend too much on the PowerPoint, but kind of use it as your guidepost. So be familiar with the material and know what you're going to say, sort of the order in which you're going to say it, and if it helps, practice it until you have it down. Next. Thanks. So a large part of any presentation is really just knowing your audience and knowing like how much can you ad-lib? How much can you sort of just talk about in a comfortable way? How much joking can you get away with? How formal do you need to be? You really need to think about who you are presenting to, think about their values, just as you do when you write a paper, right? You're thinking about your audience and letting that sort of guide your word choice, your image choice, and things like that. And if you have to study the conference a little bit, if it's somewhere you're not familiar with, if it's an audience you're not familiar with, do a little bit of research ahead of time. I think that helps. Next. But of course, like a good presentation isn't just about, it's about thinking of your material as an oral and visual medium rather than a textual medium. The principles that still apply no matter what are going to be storytelling elements. And knowing that your audience hears your information differently helps, because you can have sort of that classic story buildup with each slide and through the course of your slide, where you open up with something that grabs the ear. the attention of your audience, and you develop that information kind of slowly, build tension. You really want to build their engagement. You want them to wonder what's going to happen next. And so using storytelling principles really helps as you build towards the climax, the information delivery, the findings of your experiment, whatever it's been, and then sort of work your way down through the resolution, talking about a conclusion, giving that payoff, like, well, what did we sit through all this for? And not just sort of rambling through everything, but bringing them to a conclusion that is satisfying. So studying the 5 parts of a classic story really helps with that delivery. Next. Now let's talk a little bit more about organization. The introduction, I think, usually think of the introduction as a hook, right? And a lot of our papers in the sciences don't necessarily have a hook the way that a classic story might. We might talk about, I'm familiar with writing in medicine, right? So we might talk about the prevalence of a disease or the populations it affects, and that sort of eases a reader into the topic. But in a good presentation, we can use more of an informal hook. So we can say things like, imagine. That's a good word that gets people's attention, right? There are visual cues that we can use, such as the many people are commenting on the memes. I think that's a really good way to get an audience's engagement. Captivating visuals, more broadly speaking, a picture that is illustrating your point or posing a question. Really, I think the hook is ultimately about curiosity. So if you think about some of the stories that you've read or heard and the ways that the first sentence, draws you in, it really leverages the audience's sense of curiosity. And then, of course, as you read on the slide, you want to introduce yourself and your topic and things like that. Don't neglect those things, but play around with it a little bit. If you have the chance to be informal, you can pose your question even before you introduce yourself. There are ways to be bold and memorable that aren't formulaic. You want to remember the pieces. You don't want to neglect introducing yourself, for example. But if everybody's giving the same presentation, if you're at a conference and you're giving a PowerPoint that looks like everyone else's PowerPoint, you're going to have a harder time leaving an impression with your audience. And you're ultimately just going to blend in with the rest. And I don't think that's really doing yourself justice. I don't think it's really doing justice to your topic. But you can play around with the presentation a little bit and see, what are some ways that you can increase engagement. And I think that really comes back down to creativity. Next, please. And so, of course, there are emotional reactions. And again, you want to be a little bit careful with this. And I think we'll talk about this in several different ways through the course of our presentation. Right? I think we've had enough talking about fear in the last couple of weeks that maybe we don't need to push on that button, right, necessarily. But I really like curiosity. I think that's a really good way to drive engagement. Amusement, of course. So sometimes just being open and saying or honest or even personal, right? Saying things like, oh, I didn't rehearse that much for this presentation. Right? That is a way of connecting with your audience. Build a little bit of irony and amusement and engagement. And I think we're going to be doing stuff like that through the course of this. So hold on. Next, please. And then creating a memorable first impression. Again, just kind of goes, I talked about a little bit of this, but the link back memory formula, for example, right? If you go through a few slides and then you call back to a previous slide, that emphasizes a point. Using a bold number, a statistic, I think things like those capture the attention. Miniature stories capture the attention. facts versus myth, saying like, and this is again what happens if you really know your audience, right? You know that maybe they believe one thing, and your research is going to show them something else, and that is always a kind of a nice surprise, a way to get people's attention. Yeah, next slide. And so the other thing that Jen brought up is like, remember that your audience is listening to you. So the visual is good, but I always think of the visual as a way to not feel like everyone's eyes are on me, right? I like to teach, but I don't always like to be the center of attention. I like to have something that splits the audience's attention a little bit, so that they're maybe listening to me and following along with the visual, but I don't feel like I am doing all the lifting myself, right? So it's really nice to have a PowerPoint, to have pictures and lists and illustrations of my points, but not feel like I'm the only face on the screen, because that gets to be overwhelming for me personally. And it may differ from presenter to presenter, but I think understanding that this is by its nature a multimedia kind of delivery device, right? Where I get to use my voice, but I'm also able to use the visuals. And just kind of leaning on both of those. Yeah, next slide. I think it's you.
Great. Yeah, so talking about the body of your presentation, it's where you want to identify your key information. Like David was just saying, this is just part, like the presentation, the design of it is just part of the overall, environment. You're there with your oral information, and then you have your presentation with the design element. So you want to prioritize what you're providing. You might be talking about your research. It could have, a simple research question that you're trying to talk about, or it could be, your whole career if you're doing a faculty presentation. So you have lots and lots of research to talk about. But what you're there for is a certain purpose, and that might depend on the conference you're at or what presentation you're giving. So you want to make sure that you're identifying and you're prioritizing that key information. So that just might be one research question or one theme that has to do with your research. Not every single aspect of your research should be presented, during this presentation, because you don't want to overload your audience. You don't want to overload the slide, because you're not just, standing there reading your dissertation. So doing so, you have to identify your core message. What's that key takeaway that your audience is going to leave and be like, I learned this from this presentation, now I'm going to go tell my friends. So you need to think about that. And that's what you want to sort of highlight for each slide. So everything that you're going to present is going to be evidence or some kind of information that's related to that key message. So anything that's not related, you're going to eliminate. So if it's, the sky is blue, that has nothing to do with your research about cancer. So you don't need to include that on your slides. So anything that's not immediately relevant or anything remotely redundant, you can just remove. And that will help you really fine tune your story as well as what you're presenting on your slides. So there's also techniques to help the audience follow you. And David's mentioned this when he was talking about the body as well as the introduction. It's sort of helping you highlight your key points. So you can number your ideas. I have this hypothesis is number one, and then I have a second hypothesis and a third hypothesis, or whatever it might be. And then you could always bring that back in your design. So if you're talking about the evidence supporting hypothesis number one, you could put, a one in the corner, something like that. So the audience can link those ideas together. Because if you don't sort of have that, identifying linkage, people might forget, where this supporting evidence is coming from or what it relates back to. So having something like a number or, a bullet that's a certain color or something like that can really help. It could be a picture. I've done many presentations where the picture is the same for everything that's relating to like one point or one hypothesis. So that way the audience can follow sort of where we are in the story. Also arranging things in logical order, and this could be chronological, cause and effect, problem versus solution is also really helpful for people to follow along. Otherwise, they're going to be listening, being like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know where we are. And once that happens, they're going to just check out from your presentation entirely. And it's going to be really hard for them to be drawn back in. So you can start, it really depends on what your research is, but you can start with a small problem that then leads to a bigger problem, however, it just makes sense. And you can, if you're not sure where to go, talk about your research with somebody that's less familiar with your field and be like, does it make sense if I go chronologically this way? Does it make sense maybe if I use a different technique? Because you're going to want somebody that's less familiar with your research because they're going to be the ones that have the most problem understanding what you're talking about. If you talk about it with your coworker or your PI or somebody like that who knows, everything about your field, they're going to miss those slight or those areas that might cause slight confusion. And then another technique you can use is to repeat important ideas. You can do this using different words. It takes, I think, about 7 times for us to really remember a fact. So talking about it in different ways, using different words, using the technique of known versus new. So using it in a way that somebody might already know, and then mentioning it again in sort of this newer phrase. So if it's something that might be pretty niche to your research, maybe a topic or a term that's, specific to your world, you can maybe say something that might be a little bit more common and then bring it back to that like niche word. That could help people understand it a little bit better. And then using oral transitions can help. So firstly, we did this. Secondly, we did this. Another important point. Things like that to help move the story along can be really helpful. So then we have our introduction, our body, then we have this conclusion. So how are we going to wrap up our presentation? And this can be one of the most important parts of your presentation because this is going to be what the audience remembers and what they take home. So you're going to want to sum up your important points, reinforce that central idea. So again, that message that they're going to go tell all their friends, and then signal with a powerful ending. So how do we do this? Well, you're going to want to offer a memorable takeaway. And that could be something just like, our results are this, and these are really cool results. You can invite the audience to take action. So this could be, go read our manuscript, something as simple as that, or go tell your friends about this really cool result we found. It could be something much bigger. It all really depends. And then you can use visuals that resonate and leave a lasting impression. Or you could be like Obama and mic drop and walk away. That could be really cool too. I feel like I should do that. So now what? So we have, our structure of what we're going to talk about in our presentation. So how do we design it to make it look pretty and nice? And I'll just say this right now, don't worry about the number of slides you have. There's many different techniques that people use. So slide numbers can vary. Don't worry about that. If you have questions, you can, ask in the chat and we can respond, but we're not going to talk about the number of slides you should or should not have. So for your design, think about your layout. Typically, we just go with whatever PowerPoint has, which is a 16:9 typically. But always check with your conference organizers, especially if it's in person. Sometimes they have different, projector formats, sizes, so they might have a different ratio. So just double check when you are, getting your presentation ready for any in-person conferences. And then another thing, people tend to sort of slap together presentations willy-nilly, and they'll put photos, they'll put illustrations all over that aren't really aligned. And humans really, really like things to be, even, structured, nice looking. So you can see in this screenshot, PowerPoint has a lot of tools that you can use to help with that. So take the time, align things, use their rulers, use their grid lines, design the elements so they look nice. Otherwise people will see it and they'll see things mismatched and be like, oh, you slap that together last minute. Taking that extra 30 seconds will really elevate your PowerPoint presentation. Another thing to talk about and consider is your background. So a lot of times we like to keep things simple, just a solid color as a background. But if you wanted to get a little wild, you can think about putting an image as your background. If you do that, you have to consider what your text would look like on top of that image. So here are just a few examples of what you could do. You could have a transitional layer where you can edit it's not opacity, it's one of those elements where you can change it and it will help make your font more visible. There's different things you can do, but that just helps provide a design element that will keep your audiences engaged. Because how many presentations have you seen that has a simple white boring background? Hence ours. So you can make it fun. You can add a background that takes up an image that takes up the whole background. Just make sure you're doing it in a way that's accessible for people to still read your font choices. And when you're doing this, you want to think about your color scheme. So again, humans like structure. It's visually appeasing to our eyes. So you want consistency in your colors. You want things to be contrasting so people can see the text versus the images. But you want to make sure that it's accessible for those with color blindness. Here's just an example of don't put green on red, but we all should know or know that there's different types of color blindness. So on the resource guide that we'll send out when we send out the recording, there's going to be links where you can, learn about different color blindness and different colors that are okay for different variations. And you can think about color associations. So in the world of design, they have the color wheel and you can choose different colors that go well together. That's just visually appealing when you're doing your presentations. And if you don't want to think about any of that, you can just use the PowerPoint templates. They have, colors already put together. Your department might have their own template. At ICTR, we have a communications team who graciously just made us a template that we're using. The university might have their own, or you can have fun with it and design your own. So there's lots of options if you don't want to, do the work of doing it yourself. There might be some that are available to you. So again, we want to show, we don't just want to tell on the screen. We're telling with our voices, right? So the screen is here to just enhance what we're talking about. So 90% of all information is transmitted to the human brain visually. So we want to use striking visuals in every slide. And David mentioned this when he was talking about the introduction. You want to think about a photo that will enhance what you're talking about. And clearly I'm not talking about elephant seals, but have you seen an elephant seal smiling? I haven't until I saw this picture and it was very cute. So I wanted to put it on here. So a good way to use your visuals rather than just have a random elephant seal smiling at you is to accompany that with stats and facts that are relevant to that image. So you could think of a graph, that's going to be relevant. That's going to have your stats and your facts. But if I was giving a presentation on elephant seals, I could talk about how often they smile and put a statistics or a fact. But I Googled that and that doesn't exist. So I couldn't include that on this slide. But you want to keep your text minimal. Have them look at the image, have them listen to what you're saying. They want to be listening and learning from your voice more than reading what's on the slide. And I know we've said this basically on every slide now, but that's what's important in your presentation. Another thing to think about is one theme per slide. So our goal is to have limited text, images, all of that, right? So an easy way to do that is to think about just one theme per slide. What piece of information do you want to tell us on this slide? Because you want to balance out your information. You don't want to overload them with too much text, too much information on one slide. You don't want them staring at the same visual for 10 minutes as you talk and talk and talk. You want to keep things moving. So each slide should have a focus and make it count. Again, you're going to have that image that expresses your theme, so that's going to help you. And then if you're kind of overwhelmed by what you're trying to portray on that slide, you can break it up into more than just one slide, or you can have multiple elements for that theme. So like I said, don't think about how many slides you have. Like this presentation has 44 slides, but I've given 1 hour presentations that have like over 100 slides, depending on how I'm structuring and designing each slide. So don't worry about the number. Just do what feels right. One theme per slide, keeping it simple and making sure your point gets across. And then we want to think about negative space. So in the design world, we have negative space, which is white space. And that can be really, really useful when you're designing. When you think of like a white canvas and there's an image on it, that white is very important. It lets your designs breathe. It doesn't feel too cluttered. So if you're at home or maybe in the office, like look around, see if there's any art around you and see how they use that white space. It makes things, like I said, feel less cluttered. It lets it breathe. It feels calm. Same with your presentation. Your slide is a piece of art. Less is more. If you have too many graphs, too much text, too much whatever, it's going to be really clunky, cluttered, and people are going to feel overwhelmed and probably not pay attention to what's on your slide and maybe not even what you're saying. So less is more. Use that white space. Keep everything, all your visuals and text structured, even when you paste it on the slide, and then it will look nice and people will pay attention. And another way you could help with your design is using visual hierarchy for emphasis. So you're going to want to sort of structure your key points using different font sizes. You could use different font faces. So the style of fonts, you could use different colors. You basically want to strategically place them. So your most important points are probably going to be bigger, bolder, higher up on the page. And then as you sort of fine tune and get down to maybe the nitty gritty information, that's going to be reduced in size. So think about it as like a funnel, your broadest information. And then as you go down, things get smaller, and that's going to be more of your finer information. So organization is key in that process. So again, we're going to embrace the power of images. And I love this image from the kangaroo sanctuary. And unfortunately, this kangaroo died. It's very sad. So there's a strong image for every topic. And so we have a very strong kangaroo. So again, human mind is visual. We process images faster than we can read text. So use them. People love photos more than text. And maybe I'm biased because every time I review a presentation, I'm always telling people to add more pictures because I like to see pictures. But ask anybody you come across, and I bet you they'll tell you the exact same thing. You don't have to have a picture on every slide, but maybe every other slide. You want lots of images. But you want to make sure that they're also relevant to what you're talking about. So maybe don't put a buff kangaroo in a presentation about melanoma, unless maybe that kangaroo has melanoma, then you can. So make sure you're using appropriate images. And when you put an image on your document, make sure that you scale it appropriately. You don't want an image to get all wonky if you don't scale it right. So just make sure, you're clicking on that edge. I should have put the copy and paste of me doing it in the document. But if you click on the edge of the photo and you drag it, that's scaling properly rather than clicking on like the middle of one of the sides. You guys know what I mean. I'm sure you've all messed with images on PowerPoint. You're going to want to choose high quality images, especially because when you're in person in a conference, these are typically blown up on very large screens. So if you have a low quality image, that image is going to be blurry. It's not so much when you're doing virtual because it's typically just a computer size screen. But when you're in person, really think about the quality of your image and choose something that has a higher DPI. So maybe 300 or above. And then most importantly, you're going to want to follow copyright law. If you don't know anything about copyright law, I recommend just Googling it. You're going to want a Creative Commons license photo. Typically for education, you can get around not using that. Technically, it's legal to use any photo if you are doing it for educational purposes. But just to be safe, I tend to just use ones that, are legal. So either Creative Commons license or you have it cited. In the prior picture, you saw that it was a kangaroo sanctuary, so that was cited. But if you're doing anything outside of education, just make sure you are following copyright laws. All right, David, I think this one is you.
So we're talking about design. The other thing to think about is sort of the accessibility of images and there are a number of things that we can use. We can use, if you're giving the presentation out afterwards, remember that some folks use screen readers, so alt text is good. And it's also useful to include text under images as captions during the presentation. So sometimes folks will give them a little extra context, right? Like Jen did with the oh dear, what was that? Not a manatee. With the sea creature, right? There was and with the kangaroo, there's some good. The citation also sort of works as a caption. So describing the image is good. When you're giving the presentation, describing the image orally is good, or at least referring to it, so it's not just kind of sitting there unacknowledged, is helpful. And then, of course, when you're depicting people, it's really important to think conscientiously about how you're depicting folks of different identities, different genders and races and classes. And there are some good resources out there. There are some through the CDC that may still be available. I know that the American Psychological Association has some good resources for language. Images can be a bit trickier. The best practice there, honestly, is just to find like Jim was mentioning earlier, lean on your colleagues and having some sensitivity. We call them sensitivity readers for documents. We call them sensitivity viewers for a PowerPoint, I suppose. Just someone that you can rely on and say, hey, does this depict people in a conscientious way? So make sure you're making friends with colleagues from various disciplines and various backgrounds, because you don't want to come across, in ways that you don't mean to in your presentation. Yeah, next slide. Okay, we're gonna see how well this works. So we're talking about concision, right? And I think when we talk about sort of the language, the amount of language we use, it's sort of the phrase I like to use is economy of language. We like to be sparing, to use words like purposefully and not just have a lot of filler. So if your paper says one thing, go ahead and click Jen. If this works. So paper, you may say something in a particular way in a paper, right? And this is from a paper that I helped write. So I do take the opposite of credit, take responsibility for how some of this language turned out. But I mean, for the most part, this is passable for a paper, right? We can say these things and no one really raises too much of an eye. But you don't want to have this in your slide. Obviously, it is a lump of text. As Jen has pointed out earlier, this is the real turnoff for people's attention span. So click. You want to be more conscientious about what you're putting on the slide. Go ahead and click again. This is better material for the slide, right? This is bringing up sort of the topic that last block of text presented, but it's the topic, right? It's not the material, but you can now sort of just riff off this. Go ahead and click one more time. You just there's a knowledge gap, right? We acknowledge there's a knowledge gap, and then we just chat about what we found or what we were meaning to look into. And go ahead and go to the next slide. So in a similar way, the amount of material we put on a slide has a lot to do with our font choices. And this may seem like a really pedantic point, especially if you're used to just going along with the default settings, right? PowerPoint gives us some defaults. We know how to do our title in one size and our listed text in another, but there really are some design principles at work here, right? So we can use what's built in, but we might want to play with the text a little bit. Think about how it's going to appear on the screen on a virtual presentation versus how it might appear on an overhead projector in person. Um, and just think about how well or how poorly it's going to stretch. And think about, as Jen pointed out earlier too, the hierarchy of information. So the bigger text is going to mean a broader, more important point. And your viewers, the people, your audience is going to follow along to some extent. So just make sure that you are sort of presenting in accordance to the size of the font on the screen. And that sounds a little bit weird to say it out loud, but there's a almost like an outline quality to the slide, and you should try to follow that as you're delivering it orally. So you might want to think about, okay, I'm going to present orally the first 3 large points on this slide, and then I'm going to go back in and fill in the little more points. Or you might just do like large point, quick small points, large point, quick small points as the presentation goes on. Yeah, next slide. So there's a lot that we can do with PowerPoint, but just because we can doesn't mean we should. You don't want to have moving fonts. I'm going to try to remember how badly this looks. Okay, so some font effects can be useful. If you're clicking and they appear bit by bit, that can be helpful. But you don't want to overdo it. And that's really easy to overdo. It's easy to get carried away. It's easy to like experiment. And I've told you be bold, right? There are bad ways to be bold, and this is one of them. You do not want your text falling onto your slide, singing and dancing. That is distracting, and frankly, it's obnoxious. So a little touches go a long way, especially knowing that everybody's presentation is kind of going to be similar. Just find those little ways to stand out. That will make you memorable in a good way, not in a bad way. Go ahead. Avoid all caps, of course. Do not bold everything because it all blends together. Be very careful about your fonts. Just Times New Roman is pretty solid, but do be aware that there are folks who have different reading approaches and styles. And so just think about your audience there. Like most papers, only use left justification. Otherwise, you get weird gaps. I think we've talked about that in previous presentations. Contrasting colors, I can let you read that. Next slide. Bullet points. So this one is meant to be illustrative. Do remember that your audience is going to think of your first points as your most important. It is helpful to go one by one. So again, that appearing effect. You can grade them out as you go so that if there gets to be a lot, it gets easier to follow along. And I think Jen did a really good job of doing that in an earlier slide. Go ahead. Okay, for key takeaways. Yep. Optionally called piece dots. I did this largely because I need more points. But if you're concerned about nonviolent language, right, bullet points is considered kind of violent leaning, and you could call them, some folks call them piece dots. Next point. Is that it? Okay, that's it. So when we're talking about acronyms, and I think this has to do a bit with jargon too. This is again from a paper that I helped write, so I take some responsibility for it. We don't want too many acronyms. And I want to recognize that we use them for several reasons. For saving space, if our papers are really long, right, we might use acronyms to cut down on our word count, which is not always the best of reasons. We might think that it helps readers, right, because they're not having to look at the same thing over and over, but actually that's a common misconception, a myth, if you will. It actually increases the burden for readers. Go ahead and click, Jen, and see if the better example. So here I've broken it up, the same paragraph, into a list of points. And I think that the best use of acronyms is something familiar, right? Measurements are one that come to mind, or something that you're going to introduce early and use often. So for example, the TQPPUFDUA. I hadn't said that out loud until now. That's a mouthful. But I probably wouldn't use that again, and I probably would not want to say that often. So I would not make that an acronym. If your presentation is about social determinants of health, for example, you might use SDOH repeatedly, and that's probably fine, as long as you define it. But it is a little bit burdensome to say out loud. And if your paper identifies some kind of new phenomenon, if you're coining a term, as lots of folks like to do, it's better to repeat that term out loud rather than the acronym, because it helps your readers or your audience remember it, and it's novel to them, right? So if I were inventing the term IRB and nobody had ever heard that before, I might rather say Institutional Review Board over and over so that it helps, get into people's memory, rather than just giving you the word and then giving you the acronym from then on and you forget what it stands for. Next slide, please. So Jen mentioned before that less is more, and I think that is particularly important when it comes to putting graphs on your slide. One complex graph is okay. If you've got one slide and it's just a complicated graph and you leave it up there for a while and you're going to talk about its parts, dig into its content, that's okay. It can be a complicated graph on one slide. If you need to put two graphs on a slide, they should be simple, right? You can't overwhelm your audience with information. And usually you want to do that to compare, right? You do one kind of graph and another kind of graph. You're going to talk about the relationship between factors. That's all right. 3 or more graphs per slide though, and that is way too many. I don't care how simple they are, it will get overwhelming quickly, and it's hard to talk about that much information. So there are alternatives. If you wanted to talk about multiple graphs in relation to each other, just spread them out across slides. And be a little conscientious about that. Use diagrams and charts instead of words where possible. So if you can use a graph, do. But also, if there's unnecessary detail in them, just try to keep them simple. And if you have something complicated from a manuscript, you might consider simplifying it or breaking it into multiple slides for your presentation. Next, please. I really do not recommend putting video in slide in presentations. It almost always leads to a mess. If you have to, if it is a key part of your presentation, make sure you test it. Make sure that you understand that the audio may not work well, if at all. Conference tools, sometimes it's just unreliable, right? And sometimes there's a delay. And there are bandwidth problems all the time. Webcams already use kind of a lot of bandwidth, so just because this is another thing, just because you can embed video doesn't necessarily mean you have to. And you might try screenshots and captions instead. It would probably be my recommended workaround. And test your audio. I cannot stress that enough, because either it's going to be too quiet or, oh my goodness, if it's too loud for your audience and you don't know that until you play it, that's embarrassing. I think I've been there. I don't know if we've all been there, but I've been there. Let me tell you, learn from my mistake. Yeah, don't do that. Next, please. And so the last thing we want to talk about a little bit is I'm going to frame it as trigger warnings. I think that that has been given a bad rap in our cultural discourse. That I think that what it really is when we talk about, like, hey, warning, we're going to show something graphic. I think that is polite, right? I think that is the kind, humane thing to do for audiences in a lot of cases. And Jen and I have a couple of stories that we want to tell about that. So don't worry, we're not going to put any distressing visuals on the screen. We've got the safety vest to just kind of point out that this is going to be what we're talking about, but we don't have graphics. So these stories may be a little bit disturbing. I think we're gonna handle it in a pretty even-handed way. So I'll let Jen go first.
Yeah, quickly. So my history is in wildlife sciences. That is where I did all of my graduate work and whatnot. So a lot of work in that realm is about mortality. And so a lot of the mortality comes with images. And so I had a friend who does airplane collisions. So a lot of birds, a lot of deer hit airplanes, a lot of everything hits airplanes. And so all of his images are quite graphic. And so when he's giving presentations, there's sort of a level of graphic images that he has. So he likes to give warnings before some of the more graphic ones come on screen, because you can imagine, a large airplane hitting birds, hitting large animals if they're on the runway. Crazy things happen. And so especially if he's out giving a presentation to more community type members, those are things to consider. And it's probably more common in wildlife to show these kind of images than in the health field. And so it's really important for individuals over there to make sure we're giving trigger warnings, because, a lot of people like to talk about mortality and hunting and things like that in wildlife. And so those images can be quite disturbing for some people if they aren't expecting it. And that gives them the opportunity to, look away if they just don't want to see it.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about the medical field is, like, it is like a question of audience, really. If you're in the medical field, it's pretty common to flip through a journal and see some graphic pictures of diseases and stuff. But I wasn't expecting it when I started this role, and someone sent me a manuscript with attached images that I just was not prepared for. And so, like, I like to think about the audience and prepare them for what they're going to see, even if they know from your title or just from the field that it's going to be something, gruesome. It might be somebody's first time, right? It might be somebody's first day. So just keep that in mind. It's good to prepare folks. That's our last slide, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, anybody have questions for us?
And we have our contact information up there if you guys have questions after the fact, or just want to reach out to us to talk about presentation design. You definitely can. But I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So if you have questions, put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
So I would like to ask a question. How do you prepare for the Q&A portion, such as we're in right now? And what do you do if nobody asks any questions?
That is a marvelous question, and thank you so much for asking it. What I
You're
like
welcome.
I like to identify someone that I know, or who's going to come to the presentation, and ask them to ask me a question that is agreed upon beforehand, so that I have a nice, handy, canned response like this one. That is how I prepare for Q&As, but then, of course, you get questions that you're not prepared for, and you just answer them to the best of your ability. And if you don't know, it's fine to say, I don't know. That would be a good point for future research, or, check the references, literature. Let's talk about it after. Things like that.
I'm just looking at the chat really quick. So there's a question just sent directly to me, so you guys won't see it in there, but somebody asked that they use, in their research, they use fluorescent green and red. And they asked if there was any suggestions on how to improve accessibility when including those in your presentations. That is a great question, because, you can't really change that. I think I would just recommend just, saying it verbally, like, hey, I'm using these red and green in fluorescence. If there's anybody with colorblind issues and you would like to see these later and I can describe them better, to you, we can do that after the fact. Maybe something like that. I don't know, David, if you have any other suggestions. It gets kind of tricky when that's like inherently within sort of what your research or your in your results.
Yeah, that is tricky. I probably have to see like the exact example, right? But like, I think describing it verbally is good. Just accessibility is often just the same information presented another way, through another medium. So what can't be seen visually can be described orally, or yeah, it's probably the best answer off the top of my head.
There's some great, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Leanne.
Jen, I was just going to say, yeah, there's a question in the chat about notes and where to save them or where to have them.
Yeah, definitely. And I was also going to say there's a couple of responses to that question in the chat. And it looks like you found it, Maggie. Great. Yeah, so I think it depends if you, well, it does depend if you're doing it virtually or in person. Obviously, when you're virtual, you have that notes section on the PowerPoint, which is a really, really great feature. Oh, I see there's also a part of that question that says when the slides doesn't work when you go into presenter mode. Yeah, so if for some reason, sometimes it can get complicated when you are doing virtually, and let's just say your slides, are being a pain and you can't get that presenter mode working and you lose your notes. It's up to you and where you want to have your notes. If you do want them on the side, you can post them, right next to your screen. If you feel like you need to look at the webcam to show that you are engaging with your audience, it can be hard to feel like you're engaging with your audience when you're doing virtual. And I think that's something we're all adjusting to. I know I am. I prefer in-person presentations much better than virtual because you can engage with my audience. And here I just sort of look at myself. So yeah, having something close by so it kind of looks like you're engaging and you can see your notes is helpful. But when you're in person, people say different things like, oh, you shouldn't have notes, or it's fine to have notes. I think doing whatever you're most comfortable with, I think is best. Because you're going to be up there talking about your research. You want to be comfortable in giving the best presentation that you can. So obviously you want to practice beforehand. You want to know your stuff, but we all have different levels of, anxiety when we're presenting. So if having notes with you is helpful, like take them with you. Don't let anybody shame you into not having them. Maybe don't read them like you're reading a book and standing there. Try to make eye contact, try to engage with your audience. But if you need notes, I would suggest using them to, be comfortable and give the best presentation that you can. I don't know if you have any added thoughts, David.
I strongly agree with that. I'll show you, I've got a notebook right here where I've just got a few reminders, few points that I wanted to make sure that I made. But my notes function is working fine. I've got it on the screen here and I don't read all of it. There's actually quite a bit. And I just kind of pick out the things that I think are the most important at the moment. Also being comfortable, this is maybe a broader point that I would add, just being comfortable pausing and thinking and not having to rush through everything you say, something that I have struggled with a lot and gotten more practice in. And not feeling embarrassed when you have to shuffle through your notes or look something up or things like that.
And then another question I got was, do you put your main talking point sort of as your title slide for each slide, or do you have sort of a general title slide, or not a title slide, a general title in that slide, and then you mention your key talking point? So for me personally, I think I do both. I think it depends what I'm presenting on. And if I have sort of a theme that's going to take multiple slides, then I'll do sort of that theme as the title for those slides, because that's one way listeners, the audience, will sort of know what we're talking about. And then I'll have my main point as sort of that first bullet. But if it's just one slide, that's going to be sort of that main key point, then I might have that as a title for that slide. So I think that's just me personally. I don't know if there's a right or wrong way. I think it's pretty dependent on what your presentation is, who your audience is, how long you have. Shorter presentations obviously are more challenging because you have to get a lot more information than if you had an hour-long presentation.
Yeah, I think I have nothing to add to that. That was very well done.
And I know we had a question that was put on the registration form that I think I can end with in the last minute because I thought it was relevant, was how do these shorter presentations work? Sort of what's the best way when you have an Ignite talk that might be 5 minutes or a 10-minute presentation, or the standard conference length, which might be 12 to 15 minutes versus an hour-long presentation. And I think the shorter you go, the less text you have to have. I don't know if anybody has done an Ignite talk where you have 3 to 5 minutes. Those can be very daunting. And so a lot of times what you do is you just put an image or a graph, and then you just talk, because you don't have time to switch to a bunch of slides to have a bunch of words, because your audience can't read all of that information and listen to you. So the shorter it is, I say, the less text you have. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. You might have just, a couple slides, a few words, and like that one earlier where you just present the knowledge gap and then just talk about it and just make sure you know the material, right? And as long as you know the material really well, you don't have to lean on the slide too much, do too much lifting.
Great. Well, it's 11, so we'll let you guys out of here. We will post the recording when it is available on our YouTube. I'll send out an email that has a link to that, as well as our resource guide and the slides. We can upload the captions as well. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our next session is in March on the 14th, I believe, and it's talking about your abstracts that you submit for these conferences. So we hope to see you there. Otherwise, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.